Hello, this is Jeff Gambrone with Mississippi in the Civil War. Welcome to part two of Mississippians in the Army of Tennessee. If you have not watched part one, I suggest you go back and view it first, as you really need to see the first part to really get in the flow for what's going to happen in the second part. And we left off part one with the Battle of Murfreesboro, which took place at the end of 1862 and the beginning of 1863. And after the Battle of Murfreesboro, the Army of Tennessee went into winter quarters. And even after spring made campaigning possible, the Confederates remained on the defensive for a while. And this was basically because the Confederate Army at Vicksburg, Mississippi, had a priority on reinforcements in the spring of 1863. So in mid-June of 1863, the Union Army under General Rosecrans made an advance on Chattanooga, and over the next few months, Bragg was outmaneuvered and had to abandon the city in September of 1863, and he retreated back into the mountains south of Chattanooga. And shown here in the picture, this is one of the units that was serving in the Army of Tennessee at the time. The Liberty Guards, this is their company flag. It later became the regimental flag. And I've always had a soft spot for this flag because I actually had a relative that fought in the Liberty Guards. My great-great-uncle, Lieutenant Drury C. Godwin, was a member of Company E, 22nd Mississippi Infantry. And you always have a kind of a connection to the units your relatives fought in. You always kind of follow them a little bit closer than you do other units. And I'm happy to say that this flag has survived the years intact, somewhat worse for wear, but it's received some excellent conservation treatment, and it is on display at the Museum of Mississippi History in Jackson. Rosecrans pursued the rebel forces into the mountains, and about this time, Bragg was going to be reinforced with troops from the Army of Northern Virginia, and this is going to bring his army up to approximately 60,000 men. And among Bragg's army were 18 regiments and 3 battalions of Mississippi infantry. And on September 19, 1863, Bragg attacked Rosecrans at Chickamauga, Georgia, and in one of the few battles where the Confederates actually had the superiority of numbers. And the first day of fighting was pretty much a bloody draw. And the next day, the Confederates broke through the Union right. The Yankees were forced to retreat back into Chattanooga to avoid being destroyed. So it was a great victory for the Confederate forces. And this illustration, which is from the Library of Congress, shows Union troops advancing on the Confederate line at Chickamauga. I think it's just a great drawing. I really like it. It gives you the real feel for what the battle must have been like. And this is a map of the Battle of Chickamauga. This is from the collections of the Library of Congress. And the inset picture here is Colonel William F. Tucker, who was commander of the 41st Mississippi Infantry. And in his after-action report on the Battle of Chickamauga, Colonel Tucker wrote this about the battle. He said of his unit, quote, "The 41st Mississippi was advancing at a double quick through the woods when it was met by Manigault's men, and for a moment was thrown into confusion as they burst through its ranks. But the men responded with a regular Mississippi yell to the command forward and dashed at the enemy, who immediately fled." So Colonel Tucker was very proud of his men, and he certainly made that apparent in his after-action report. The Battle at Chickamauga was one of the bloodiest battles in the Western theater of the war. It cost the Confederates somewhere around 18,000 casualties, killed, wounded, and missing. And for Mississippi, Chickamauga was one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. Combined losses among all the Mississippi units involved in the fighting at Chickamauga was probably close to 2,000 killed, wounded, and missing. And shown here in the picture is an illustration from the Daily Clarion from Meridian, Mississippi, reporting on the Battle of Chickamauga in September of 1863. And the inset picture is it's a post-war picture of Colonel Jacob H. Sharp, who commanded the 44th Mississippi Infantry at the Battle of Chickamauga. And in his official report on the Battle of Chickamauga, he had this to say about how the battle just decimated his regiment. And he said, quote, "We went into action with 272 officers and enlisted men and lost 81 killed and wounded. Among the killed was Major John C. Thompson, fearless among the fearless. He fell as he had wished to fall, fighting the foe that had invaded his home." It amazes me that units like the 41st can take those kind of losses and still keep going. I mean, they went into the battle with 272 men and came out with 81 killed and wounded. And it was 44th Mississippi, excuse me, I think I said 41st there a minute ago, but it's 44th Mississippi. But it just amazes me that units could take that kind of punishment and still maintain their unit cohesion. Now, after the terrible slaughter at Chickamauga, Bragg followed the Union Army to Chattanooga and laid siege to the city. He placed his forces on the hills and the mountains surrounding Chattanooga, and while he was besieging them, however, the Union forces were being reinforced, and at the Battle of Missionary Ridge on November 24th, 25th, 1863, the Confederates were driven from the heights overlooking Chattanooga and then forced to retreat into North Georgia. This was a bitter defeat for the Confederates, and during the fighting, the Mississippi Brigade of General Edward C. Walthall, who's shown in this picture here, and it's a post-war image, but it's a very good image of General Walthall. They particularly distinguished themselves in the battle. They suffered about 972 casualties in the fight at Lookout Mountain. On the second day of the battle, another Mississippi brigade, that of General Mark P. Lowry, played a very important role in the fighting at Tunnel Hill, holding open the retreat route for the Army of Tennessee so they could make good their escape. And shown in the inset here is General Mark P. Lowry. And the illustration shows the Battle of Ringgold, Georgia, which took place in November of 1863. And the Army of Tennessee had retreated to Ringgold, where Lowry's brigade was part of a force called on to delay the Union pursuit, while the Army again made good its escape. On November 27th, 1863, the Mississippians of General Lowry's brigade were very heavily engaged at Taylor's Ridge. In his after-action report, General Lowry had this to say about his men. He said, quote, "When my ammunition was nearly exhausted and I had sent for more, my men and officers gave me assurance with great enthusiasm that they would hold the position at the point of the bayonet and with clubbed muskets if the enemy dared to charge them." And they did successfully hold open the retreat route, and the Army was able to make good its escape. After the Confederate rout at Missionary Ridge, Braxton Bragg resigned as commander of the Army of Tennessee on December 27, 1863. Jefferson Davis appointed Joseph E. Johnston as the new commander of the Army of Tennessee. And by the spring of 1864, it was very evident to the Mississippians in the Army of Tennessee that heavy fighting was about to take place. General William T. Sherman of the Union Army was poised to advance into Georgia, and on April 24, 1864, Lieutenant Lewis G. Sleeper of the 44th Mississippi Infantry wrote, quote, "The enemy has doubtless concentrated his entire force in our front. Johnston seems to be making every preparation to welcome them to hospitable graves beneath the clod of good old Georgia." And Sleeper was very right about this. There were going to be casualties aplenty in the coming 1864 campaign for Georgia. And this is a map of northern Georgia that was made during the war. It's from the Library of Congress collections. In May of 64, Sherman moved into North Georgia, his objective, of course, being the city of Atlanta, Georgia. Johnston retreated to Resaca, Georgia, where he was reinforced with troops from Mississippi. Included in this force were 3 brigades of Mississippians serving under Generals Winfield Scott Featherston, John Adams, and Claudius Sears. With these additions, there were at least 33 Mississippi infantry units serving with the Army of Tennessee, making this probably with the largest concentration of Mississippi commands to ever serve in one Confederate army. And for the next 3 months, Sherman flanked the Army of Tennessee out of one position after another, all the while moving ever closer to Atlanta. During the campaign, Mississippians saw action at places that are well known to students of the Civil War, places with names like Resaca, New Hope Church, Kennesaw Mountain. At all of these places, the Confederates fought very bravely, but Johnston was unable to stop the Union march on Atlanta. And during this constant marching and retreating, Sergeant Major John T. Kern of the 45th Mississippi Infantry took the note to write this little note in his diary on May 22nd, 1864. He scribbled down, quote, "We have passed through some of the prettiest country on this move that I have ever seen. It is hard to give up so much of our Dixie to the vandal hordes of Lincoln. God will surely aid us in driving them back to their bleak north and give us our goodly land in his own time when he finds that we have suffered enough and are worthy." And there will be suffering aplenty as this campaign went on. By mid-July, the Federals were almost within sight of Atlanta, and Jefferson Davis had finally had enough. He was afraid that Johnston was just going to withdraw south of Atlanta and just leave the city to the Federals. So Johnston was replaced in command of the Army of Tennessee with General John Bell Hood. General Hood immediately took the offensive and assaulting the Federals on July 20th and the 22nd. In the fighting on the 20th of July, Featherston's brigade suffered 616 casualties out of about 1,200 men engaged. And on the 22nd, Lowry's Mississippi Brigade had about 276 casualties. In another assault on July 28th at Ezra Church, the Mississippi Brigades of Generals William Brantley and Jacob Sharp suffered another 340 casualties. And shown in this picture is the battlefield of Peachtree Creek, Georgia, where fighting took place on July 20th. And this is very close to the site where a number of Mississippians were killed. And in fact, you can see in this picture a number of graves in the foreground. And they're not identified, but these could very well be the graves of Mississippians that died in the fighting at Peachtree Creek. All of Hood's attacks were defeated with heavy casualties for the Army of Tennessee. And then the fighting settled down into siege warfare, with both sides sheltering in extensive earthwork entrenchments. In late August, Sherman sent some of his forces on a flanking march to cut the railroad line below Atlanta and try and cut the flow of supplies to the Confederate Army. Hood attempted to block this flanking movement at the Battle of Jonesboro, Georgia, August 31st, 1864. After bloody fighting, the rebel attack was repulsed, and Hood had no choice. He was forced to evacuate Atlanta. The 1864 Atlanta campaign cost the Confederates thousands of casualties that they could ill afford at this stage of the war. There were over 27,000 casualties, and many of them were Mississippians. The Mississippi regiments and the Army of Tennessee were so depleted in numbers that many of them had to be consolidated with several regiments being combined just to form one unit that had enough men to be combat effective. And having lost Atlanta, Hood took his 40,000-man army north into Tennessee, hoping to draw the Federals after him. In November 1864, he moves into Tennessee, hoping Sherman's going to pursue. Marching with the Confederate Army were 31 infantry regiments and 3 battalions of Mississippi infantry. Hood's plan to lure the Federals out of Georgia failed. Sherman only detached a very small portion of his army to try and stop Hood. And General George H. Thomas of the Union Army was left to deal with the rebels in Tennessee while Sherman made his famous march from Atlanta to the sea. And on the evening of November 30th, 1864, Hood threw almost 16,000 of his infantry against a very strong position at Franklin, Tennessee. This picture here is of the cotton gin at Franklin, where some of the bloodiest fighting of the Battle of Franklin took place. The Mississippians who fought at Franklin fought with great determination, and they had the casualty list to prove it. They suffered approximately 1,200 men killed or wounded, and 423 Mississippians that were killed at Franklin are buried in the Confederate cemetery at Carton Plantation. This is the greatest number of any southern state that has men buried at that cemetery. Corporal Abner J. Wilkes of the 46th Mississippi Infantry simply said of the Battle of Franklin, quote, "Then we made an attack on Franklin. Oh my God from heaven, it rained fire and brimstone for some time if it ever did in the world." Franklin was a battle that the Mississippians never forgot, and I don't think they ever got over. The losses they suffered were just crippling. But despite the horrible losses that the Army of Tennessee had sustained, Hood continued to follow the retreating Federal Army that had pushed on to Nashville after the Battle of Franklin. He pursued with the Army of Tennessee, which was reduced to about 24,000 men. The Mississippi units still with the Army were just mere shells of their former selves. The largest Mississippi command in the Army of Tennessee was Lowry's Mississippi Brigade, which numbered just over 1,000 men, which was the size of a single regiment at the beginning of the war. On December 15th and 16th, 1864, General George Thomas attacked Hood with about 50,000 men, and the Army of Tennessee just simply shattered. During the retreat back to Mississippi from Tennessee, the Army basically just came apart as individual groups and small bands of men just made their own way back into Mississippi, struggling with worn-out clothes, insufficient food, poor shelter. The men that made it back into Mississippi were just in horrible condition by the time they had made it. James R. Benford of the 15th Mississippi Infantry noted on that retreat back into Mississippi, he said, "My heart almost bled as I saw traces of blood in the icy slush that came from the bare feet of our brave soldiers." And eventually, 13,000 exhausted, starving survivors of the Army of Tennessee limped into Tupelo, Mississippi. The physical condition of these men can only be described as horrible. William P. Chambers, who was a sergeant in the 46th Mississippi Infantry, wrote in his diary about his regiment. He said, the regiment numbers about 150 men, about half of whom are barefooted. All are ragged and dirty and covered in vermin. There are perhaps 20 guns, but not a single cartridge box in the regiment. And despite these horrible conditions that caused many men to desert from the Army and just go home, and many Mississippians resolved to stay and fight it out to the end. And about 5,000 men from the Army of Tennessee were sent as reinforcements to General Joseph E. Johnston in 1865, who was operating in the Carolinas. Among these troops were 4 very depleted brigades of Mississippi infantry. The exact number of these men is not really known, but it was probably less than 1,000 men. The Mississippians sent to Johnston saw their last action of the war in the battle at Bentonville, North Carolina, March 19, 1865. And shown here is a picture of Bentonville, and when Johnston was unable to stop William T. Sherman's march through North Carolina, he was repulsed and forced to retreat. On April 26, 1865, Johnston surrendered to Sherman at Durham Station, North Carolina. After signing their paroles, the Mississippians were left to make their way home as best they could across a desolated southern landscape. And this brings to an end part 2 of Mississippians in the Army of Tennessee. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you have any questions or comments, please leave them. And if you liked this video, please leave a like. It really helps me gauge an idea of the interest, and gives me an idea of how many of these videos I should be doing. I will tell you that I am already planning my next video. It's going to be an overview of Mississippians that served in the Army of Vicksburg, basically the army that was defending the city of Vicksburg in 1863. I hope to have that out within the next week or so, but stay tuned. It is forthcoming. But thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this video, and if you did, again, please just leave a like and a comment. Thank you very much.